This is the reading of pages 240 to 247. So we're in chapter 8, the Greeks and their view of nature, and check out the picture. In the next two chapters, we'll get to know another great civilization, ancient Greece. Greek ideas about human abilities and the workings of human nature mark a big turning point in the human odyssey. In fact, the ideas that came out of Greek civilizations are the basis for some of our most important ideas today. In the United States and other nations, we have learned much from the ancient Greeks, our form of government, many of the words we use, some of the literature we read, the images and themes of our art, our ideas about freedom and the value of the individual, the way we think about the world around us. All of these have been deeply influenced by the ancient Greeks. If it had not been for the Greeks, we would not be who we are today. In a way, as the English poet Percy Bysshe Shelley once said, we are all Greeks. Who were the Greeks? Jutting into the Mediterranean Sea is the rugged peninsula that in ancient times made up mainland Greece. A thin strip of land connects the northern section of the peninsula with the southern section. The southern section is known as the Peloponnese and is sometimes called the Peloponnesian Peninsula. About one-third of the size of Italy, this mountainous land is flanked by the Aegean Sea to the east and the Ionian Sea to the west. Hundreds of islands dot these seas. So you can see here's Africa and here's Asia and right in there, and then there's Italy right there. Southeast of the Peloponnesian Peninsula lies a large island called Crete. Look at the map below, locate the Peloponnesian Peninsula, Crete, the Mediterranean Sea, the Aegean Sea, and the Ionian Sea. Okay, so here's the Aegean Sea, Mediterranean, Ionian, Peloponnesian Peninsula. As early as 3000 BC, civilization was flourishing on the island of Crete. Historians call it the Minoan civilization after the legendary king Minos. You may have read stories about Minos. According to ancient myths, he built a labyrinth, a complicated maze on Crete to house a monster called the Minotaur, which had the body of a man and the head of a bull. The Minoans constructed beautiful palaces with grand courtyards. They made pottery and jewelry, sailed the Mediterranean, and developed a system of writing. People had settled on the stony islands and craggy shores of the Peloponnesian Peninsula as well, but civilization was slower to develop there. Why? Because farming was rocky, land was difficult, this rocky land was difficult. There were no predictable flooding rivers, no broad fertile plains. It took a while for early inhabitants to cultivate more food than they needed. Can you explain how a surplus of food is related to the development of civilization? Even though there was no flooding river on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, there were springs that fed small valleys. The people began to farm in these spring-fed regions. Fertile coastal areas also caught the eye of determined settlers, and Greek farmers began sowing wheat and barley on their meager plots. In time, these scant resources were made to yield a surplus. The first civilization to develop on the mainland of Greece is called Mycenaean. By 1600 BC, the Mycenaeans built fortified towns around central palaces. They had kings and priests. They dominated the region and probably traded with the Egyptians and the Hittites. They buried their rulers in long shaft graves along with treasures of bronze, silver, and gold. They had writing too. Historians think that around 1200 BC the Mycenaeans won a war against the city of Troy in Asia Minor. The conflict is known as the Trojan War, after the inhabitants of the city of Troy, who were called Trojans. Eventually, people began to tell wonderful legends about the war. You may have read some tales about the Trojan War from a long poem called the Iliad by the Greek poet Homer. Because of war, invasion, and internal strife, Mycenaean civilization passed away. Their system of writing was lost. Some Mycenaeans fled to Asia Minor. Others returned to life in isolated villages. It was a dark age, and memories of past glory lived on only in the poems people recited and songs they sang. By 700 BC, however, small city-states were flourishing with names such as Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Ithaca. Some of these city-states were on the mainland, while others were on islands in the Mediterranean Sea. Each was separate and ruled itself. Each was surrounded by fields for crops and herds. The people who lived in these city-states did not think of themselves as one nation. They were citizens of Athens or Sparta or Corinth. Over time, however, the people in these separate city-states did come to think of themselves as one people. They called themselves the Hellenes. We call them the Greeks. They were one people because they shared the same language and beliefs, worshipped the same gods, and had the same stories and heroes. They had the same culture, a culture that was unique in some remarkable ways. Locate the city-states of Athens and Sparta on the map on page 242. Athens and Sparta are in rocky, mountainous areas. So here's the map in the early Greek civilizations. So look and see if you can find Athens and Sparta. And let's see, several cities and towns in the United States are named after ancient Greek city-states, including Athens, Georgia, Corinth, Mississippi, Sparta, Wisconsin, Syracuse, New York, and Ithaca, New York. Are there any towns with Greek names in your state? Yes, there are. Michigan has a Sparta, Michigan, and there is a Ithaca, Michigan. All right, page 244. The sea and the climate. As you can tell from looking at the map, the land of the Greeks was different from other lands we've studied. It had few large rivers. In fact, many rivers in Greece dry up in summer for want of rain. What ancient Greece lacked in rivers, it made up for in sea. The sea was Greece's great waterway, linking the mainland and hundreds of islands. The long arms of the sea stretched into the coasts around many peninsulas. The Aegean, Ionian, and Mediterranean seas became all-important highways for trade and travel. Fishermen, merchants, sailors, even pirates went to sea for a living. Small ships carried goods and ideas back and forth. For half the year, sailing could be hard in this region of the Mediterranean. From November to April, high winds and heavy rains often kept Greek ships at home, but for the other half of the year, the climate was warm and dry. There were few storms or high waves to trouble the sailors, and they could get on with the business of fishing, trading, and colonizing. That is, setting up new homes far away. The Greeks were fascinated by the blue sea surrounding their home. On a sunny day, the water sparkles like sapphire. On cloudy days or at sunset, it appears dark purple. Perhaps that's why the Greeks often call it the wine-dark sea. One of the Greeks' earliest and greatest poems, Homer's Odyssey, tells of the hero Odysseus and his long homeward journey over the sea after the Trojan War. The adventures of Odysseus in storms and shipwrecks are favorite Greek stories. So the origins of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The poet of the Iliad and the Odyssey is generally identified as Homer. According to tradition, long ago in Greece, a blind poet, Homer, wandered from city to city and earned his living by reciting poems, including the Iliad and the Odyssey. Many scholars agree that a real poet named Homer did indeed live in the 8th century BC, and that he composed these great poems, basing them on old legends. Others say that the Iliad and the Odyssey belong to the time long before written history, when the stories of heroes' deeds were sung and recited, and so passed down by word of mouth from one generation to another. In this way, they believe these great poems grew, being added to and gradually shaped through many years. Let's see, it took Odysseus 10 years to get home. He might have reached home more quickly by land, but no Greek would walk when he could sail. Let's read 2 descriptions of the sea from the Odyssey. In the first selection, Homer describes the sea as a friend. He begins with a poetic comparison to describe how the sea urges a ship along on its voyage, and then he goes on to describe a calm harbor. And we'll read this in part 2 of the reading.